Good evening, and welcome to Wednesday Night Alive with Paulette, but I'm not Paulette. I think most people would know that, actually, because they know you so well. But I am the one she asked to do the opening prayer, so please join me in an opening prayer. So as we come to share this evening with each other, we know and remember, once again, that God is all there is. And remembering this truth, we will also remember that each and every one of us here and beyond here are unique and individuated expressions of God. Living and acting from this truth, we move into this evening with gratitude. Gratitude for Greg in the booth, sending it out to whoever wants to watch out there, to every person sitting in the chairs here who want to see it in person and share it that way, and to Paulette for the wonderful words she's going to be speaking up here on stage. And with that gratitude, we know that this evening unfolds in divine order, right action. So no matter what happens, it's still divine order, right action. And with gratitude once again, I now release this word to law, allowing the law to do its perfect work, knowing with absolute certainty that love prevails, and together we say, and so it is.
Thank you. Okay, and well, thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm excited to see how this turns out. I have to have faith. I've been working today, so had no time to prepare, and that's good. So here we go. You know, I want to talk about life, and I want to talk about the meaning of life and how we come to find meaning in life, to search for meaning in life. And we are individuals that have evolved, and we have the gift of language, of spoken and the written word. And one of the most powerful tools we have in that collection of tools we have known as language is the idea of the metaphor. The metaphor reveals great truths to us. And language, using the metaphorical language of the hero and the saint, it really has shaped our Western culture. It has shaped our approach to life in many, many ways that we'll take a look at tonight. And so when we look at this metaphor, this idea, we're really searching for meaning of life. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So if we take life, we think of it as this progression, this linear progression along a timeline, so to speak. But there might be a better way to look at it, and that might be to imagine yourself that bending that timeline into a circle with you at the very center of that circle, and at any time you are equal distance from what? From death. Oops, I should turn this on. Hold on. From death. So when we look for meaning, when we say, what is the meaning of life, that presupposes that we've already asked another question, does life have meaning? And some folks, like existentialists, would come up with a completely different answer than one might expect. Let's assume for the discussion that we're talking about, later we'll talk about existentialism and how that fits into all of this. But for now, let's just assume that life has meaning, that we can assume that life has meaning. And part of the meaning that life has is life has an inseparable companion, and it is death. Death is our inseparable companion. That we are always, death could take us at any time, any one of us. And what we're really talking about is how do we achieve meaning out of our life and meaning out of our death. And many philosophers have tackled that in one way or another. And the most beautiful metaphors that have arisen as far as cultural genomes are two of them. One is the hero and one is the saint. So let's talk about those cultural icons and talk about what they mean for you and me in our daily lives. That's really important. And so we look at, first of all, the hero. And the hero is this metaphorical figure that driven. The major force is honor, and it engages in a struggle. The hero engages in this struggle against impersonal forces that are indifferent to the suffering of you and me, of human beings. And yet, that's what we do every day. We struggle against impersonal forces. And that's what kind of life boils down to in many cases. That's the activity of humans here. But how do we get meaning out of all of that? And so we view the hero, this iconic metaphorical figure, we view it with a great deal of respect and admiration. We think that's great. Think of any, we think of sports hero, quote unquote, sports heroes today. We admire them. Magic Johnson was an amazing athlete, and so we respect his ability as an example. He might be an example of this iconic idea about the metaphorical hero. And from the hero, we look for inspiration. Isn't that it? We see someone, oh, they did a great job. Wow, how inspiring that is. And so we'll look at the heroic idea of humanity, and we'll look at the other one, which is the saint. The saint's driving force is love, and it is characterized by a covenant, an agreement. You're an attorney, you know a great deal about agreements. And so that is the earmark. It's a covenant, and we'll take a look at some of the most outstanding in the genealogy of these two metaphorical types. And we'll take a look at that and see where this idea about a covenant. Maybe a few months ago I did a talk here about a covenant with life, creating an agreement with life. And it is an exchange. It's an expectation of receiving something in exchange for giving something. And we'll talk about that, and that fits right within the saintly metaphor. We look at the saint with gratitude and humility, and we honor the saints. We look at saintly people, and we wonder, how do we become more like that person? Because from the saintly metaphor, we're seeking help. We need assistance, and so my kids, and they're not particularly religious, when they lose something, I don't know why. They always say, ask St. Francis, say it 4 times. Okay, and usually they find stuff. I don't know how that works, but somehow they make it work because they've integrated that into their belief system. I don't know that they really believe it, but geez, it usually works. So that is complete surprising. So we'll look at the hero, and we'll look at the saint, and we'll look at the genealogy of the two, how they have developed throughout history, and we'll look for the heroic figure, the basis of the heroic figure. We're going to look at ancient Greece. Wow, what a surprise. It's amazing how many times you come up with, you're talking about literature or science, mathematics, any of those things. You've got to go back to the Greek experience because it transformed primarily Western society, and our laws are based in Greek laws, etc. And so it has amazing impact on our lives. So let's talk about those two things, the hero and the saint, and how they came to be. And later, we'll talk about the merging of the two into something known as the secular saint. If you think of secular saint, someone who are of the world, but is saintly in their, I don't know, I think of like Princess Di might come to mind, someone like that. That would be, I think, a good example of a secular saint. So let's take a look at those, and let's take a look first at the heroic image and talk about ancient Greece. And there's lots to talk about when we get to ancient Greece. I'm so fascinated by Greek culture. So when we take a look at this, This is the emergence of the tragic hero. So if you look at Greek history, we really break it down for discussions of what we're talking about in 2 major segments. So from about 1500 BC to about 700 BC, we enter the pre-classical, what's known as the pre-classical period of Greece. And contained within that period is the development of the Homeric legends, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and others. The Iliad and the Odyssey were as sacred texts to the Greeks as a Bible might be to a fundamentalist Christian or a very devout person of Jewish faith. And so what happened was around 700 BC, we have the emergence of these city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, those sorts of things. And what emerged out of that is something known as the goat song. Okay, so this is the development of the tragic hero, and it happens through something known as the goat song. When someone in the Athenian city-states started out in Athens, and it spread to Thebes and all these others. Never went to Sparta, by the way, because Sparta were too, busy preparing for war and that sort of thing. But in Athens, this idea about the city-state included the idea that when someone of note passes away, they would have something called agon, the agon. And the agon was a contest, and it symbolized the struggle between life and death. Remember, we talked very at the beginning that life and death are tied together. And so someone passes away, we have experienced their death as a collective society in these city-states, and we stage these games that are symbolic of this struggle between life and death. But what happened in addition to that was something emerged known as the goat song. And the goat song translated in English is the tragedy. So we have this tragic it was an idea. It was actually, so the agon was a spiritual exercise, even though it was games and fighting and that sort of thing. And this was a spiritual exercise. It was a display put on for the gods, so to speak. And it examined some serious questions. Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. Euripides was more comedy, but Sophocles and Aeschylus were famous tragedians who wrote these plays that were performed for the glory of the gods. They became part of the agon, and tragedy means goat song. So they were no longer sacrificing goats, as an example. They were now engaging for the benefit of the gods and of each other, engaging in these plays. And one of them that we're looking at here was by Sophocles, and it was Oedipus Rex. Anybody know about the story of Oedipus Rex? In general, I won't go into the whole detail, but basically he was born to a king and a queen in this city. The Delphic oracle told the king that this child that was just born will someday kill his father and marry his mother. Well, the king was upset about that. We can't let that happen, so let's kill this child. Let's put it out on a mountain to die. And they do that. And a shepherd comes along, finds the child, rescues the child, raises the child, and at one point, the child is now a man and decides to go off on an adventure, and he heads to this city, and he meets what he thinks is a brigand on the road, and he kills him in a fight. Not knowing that that was the king of the city and his biological father. He went into the city. The king was now gone. He was consoling the queen. Somehow he met the queen. He was consoling her, and they ended up being married. And so when a blind prophet came to him and told him the story of what had happened, he lost his mind. He said, "Oh my God, the prophecy has been fulfilled." And so he gouges his eyes out to wander the earth in darkness. That is the heroic figure. Now, what you want to take a look at the psychological archetypes that were going on within this story. And one of them is this idea about the Greek worldview. So it's framed in the Greek worldview, and the Greek worldview consisted of these three things: Anarche, Moira, and Arete. So let's talk about what really that was. Anarche is the struggle itself against impersonal forces, forces that are indifferent to the suffering of humankind, right? So that idea is that there are struggles. Life is filled with struggles. There is the will of the gods. There's will of other people that create situations that I need to deal with. And so the Greek tragic hero operates in this kind of environment. And when we talk about Moira, it's the individual fate, the individual destiny of a person. And arete is the virtue, the ultimate virtue, to be able to do something that no one else on the planet can do. Just you. You're the only one who can do that. And when you achieve perfect virtue in whatever it is you're trying to achieve, that is the idea about arete. It is something that the heroic person struggles to achieve. Arete. So fate, Moira, is the fate. You operate within your own individual fate. And arete is this stuff that's coming at you. All of the will of the gods and all these hardships that are coming my way. I have to deal with all of that. And if I understand that I have a destiny, individual destiny, and if I engage in the highest virtue, which is to achieve, to do whatever I can to achieve this. And you can see this is reflected in the Olympian heroes, for instance, the Olympics. You know, there's a lot of other people who are really skilled at archery or whatever it is, and so I've got to compete against them. That's my destiny. And if I come out as the best, that is the highest virtue. So it's a continuous search for excellence. That's really what the Greek life was all about. And that's just not a car commercial that used to be on a number of years ago, the continuous search for excellence. So this is the development of the prototype. This is where the roots of this prototype, this heroic struggle, begins in ancient Greece. And we talk about the tragic hero, but there were other kind of heroes that they talked about. One of the heroes they talked about was the idea of the citizen hero. Does this picture look familiar? This is the guy, Socrates. Socrates had a student by the name of Plato, and Plato wrote something known as the Apology. And believe me, it was not apologetic at all. It talked about the death of Socrates. You know, Socrates died in 399. He killed himself when he didn't really have to. But we'll talk about that. He felt that he had to. So the Peloponnesian War had waged for 27 years between Sparta and Athens. And Sparta eventually they won that war, and they imposed an oligarchy on Athens. They destroyed Athenian democracy, and they imposed an oligarchy, you know, a family, basically. Here, you guys are going to run this show here. And so Socrates was a gadfly. Socrates was the kind of guy who would go out in the public square and openly accuse the leaders of corruption and all of that stuff. And they didn't want to hear that. So they got together and they came up with this scheme to accuse him of corrupting the youth of Athens. My God. The youth of Athens, they already were well on their way to corruption. They knew how to be corrupt just fine. They didn't need Socrates' help. But that's what he was charged with. And so he was sentenced to death. But they really just wanted to get rid of him. They were hoping that he would they left his cell open. He could have walked out and left and never seen again. They would have said, just fine, as long as we got rid of the bastard. So they hated him, and he was this gadfly who would not shut up. So in the Apology, after his death, Plato writes this book called The Apology, and he basically talks about the Socratic version of how this all came about. And Socrates talks about that Socrates through Plato talks about the fact that he went to see the Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle at Delphi, I don't know if you know this, but historically it was located in this area that people believe there were fissures in the ground and methane gas was escaping. And so they were kind of mindless, and they would give you very ambiguous answers. Socrates asked them questions about the meaning of life, and the answers were not usable to him at all. He said, well, this is just pretty much gibberish, and so I can't figure out the meaning of life from there. Therefore, I've got to live in the question. There's a key idea right there, to live in the question. If I don't know the answers to everything, if I don't know anything, and that's what he said, all that I know is that I know nothing, then that forces me to live in the question, to continue continually ask about the meaning of life and to direct my search for the meaning of life using that as my guidepost, that as my light that I can follow. This idea about living in the question. And he said, you know, all I know is that I know nothing. It's a very famous line from Socrates there. And so he says, what should I do? He said, I've been accused of this crime, which I didn't commit, but nonetheless, I've been convicted of it. And so he talked about the idea about justice. You must deal with the idea about justice all the time. That's a very important point. So I'm dealing with justice. Is it justice? Justice through citizenship, through this citizen hero, can that bring meaning to life? Being just this citizen hero? Well, for me, it does, Socrates says, basically. And so he says this gives meaning to life, being a citizen, and citizens are supposed to have all the same rights, the same ideas, the same responsibilities, which should be all the same. So who am I to skip out on my responsibility to the state? And therefore, that would cause me all my life. I've talked about things against this. And so now, well, they're asking me basically to forget all that and to stop asking the question, to stop living in the question. And I can't do that because an unexamined life is just not worth living. There it is, the famous line, an unexamined life is not worth living. And with that, he pops a little bit of a poison, a hemlock, and dies. He didn't have to do that. But his idea about living in the question drove him to do that. And Socrates was truly embodied the idea of this citizen hero. So we see the idea about the heroes. We have the classical hero, the tragic hero coming out of Greek drama, and of the goat song, which was really done for the good of the gods, for the purposes of honoring the gods. And and now we move into this idea about the citizen hero, and the question that comes up is citizenship enough to confer meaning on life? That's a pretty heavy question. And Socrates answered it through Plato in this book known as the Apology, which again was nothing. Not apologetic, not at all. But Plato wrote some other Platonic dialogues, and one of them he wrote was called the Republic. Let's talk about the Republic for a while. The Republic asks the question, is virtue its own reward? Is it good enough to be good? Is that in and of itself, or do you need some payback, some payoff for being good? That's really what this is all talking about, and it's framed within the framework of the story that was in the Apology, i.e. the death of Socrates. So we come up with the allegory of the cave, and it's one that I actually have used this slide in maybe 3 or 4 different subjects that I talk about, because it's an amazing allegory, and I want to talk to you about it a little. It's right in this thing. So he talks about the philosopher king, and that Socrates was was perfect person to be the philosopher of kings, because he really understood life, that life is asking questions, is living in the mystery of life, that it's living in that mystery. And he talked about how only someone who lives that kind of life should be in charge of the state. And he talks about generally people, and he uses this metaphor. So I don't know if you can see this up here, but what we've got down in the bottom is a bunch of prisoners, right? And they've spent their whole life there, and they're chained to a wall, and their only view is these images up here, and the way they get those images is above them there's a big bonfire and they're coming by with cutouts and things like that, and all of those different kind of shapes, and running around and making. And so these poor folks down here, they spent their whole life just looking at that, and they believe that that's reality. That's an absolute reality. But one of them somehow escapes and makes his, you see some little ambient light, and someone somehow makes his way up through this and emerges into the world and sees the sun and sees the ocean and trees and feels the breeze on his face, and oh my God, this is reality. This is what real reality is all about. And so he finds his way back down to these folks here, and he tells them about, you can't believe it, it's beautiful out there. There's water and there's all of these beautiful things going on. This is an illusion. And they look at him and their response is, you're blinded by the light. You ever hear that phrase? That's where it comes from, that you're blinded by the light. You don't see the truth because we know the truth because we've been exposed to it our entire lives. It's these shadows on this wall. That's truth, not the beautiful sun and all of that out there. You've been blinded by the light. And so he equates that with the idea of Socrates, the philosopher king, and said only those who have seen the light, so to speak, should be in a position of power to determine the formation of our city-state. Because, you know, Greek philosophy is broken down into three major questions. That's all Greek philosophy deals with. Three questions. What do I know and how do I know it? So the ontology and the epistemology of knowledge. What is it that I know? And the second is, once I know that, how do I behave? How do I act once I know all of this other stuff? And the third part is the idea about governance. How do we come together? So Greek philosophy is based upon knowledge, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance. Governance was extremely important to the Greeks, and it's reflected in the Homeric dialogues, I mean the Homeric legends, and also into the idea of Plato in the Republic. So let's talk about, what else have I got to talk? Yeah, here's the deal. One of the major ideas behind the idea of the allegory of the cave is that you and I, we must take responsibility for asking meaningful questions of ourselves. It's just what the other guys were saying about living in the question. So Plato thought a lot about this. And so he talked about living in the question and asking meaningful questions. That's what Socrates thought it was all about. And so that's what Plato picks up in this idea of the Republic. Ask meaningful questions, live in the question, live in the mystery, and ask questions. That is a way of life, and that journey gives us meaning in life. It confers meaning upon life. And so we looked also at the genealogy of how we come to gain knowledge. And there's two different genealogies. One ascends through Aristotle, and the other ascends through Plato. Aristotle believed that we experience life by, well, experience it. We come to gain knowledge. Remember the first question about Greek philosophy was, what do I know and how do I come to know it? So how do we come to know something? Aristotle said the only way we come to know something is through experience. We got to touch it or have somehow some experience of it. Otherwise, we really can't know anything. What we think might be beliefs are nothing more than opinions. Well, Plato didn't agree with that. Plato said there's another way of looking at things, and that is this reason. So the inductive reasoning of Aristotle, in other words, you look at the particular and come to the general, and the deductive logic of Plato. So Plato looked at things as they are and deduced from it things that we've never experienced. And so the two genealogies of how we come to know, one of them led to things like empiricism, the scientific method, all of that sort of stuff, and the other led, Platonic thinking eventually would lead to formation of new thought religions, as an example, and looking at life and knowing that there's another way to know something other than through experiencing it, that we can experience things that we just know, but we've never experienced them. So those are two separate branches of knowledge. And we've done completely different lectures just about that subject, about the different types of knowledge and how we come to know what we think we know, or what we think we know. So now I'm going to switch. We've talked about the hero, this metaphorical idea, and that has its roots in ancient Greece. But now we're going to talk to the saintly hero, and where it has its roots is in the story of Abraham. The story of Abraham. Now, the struggle of the saint is characterized, the life of the saint is characterized by three things. First is a calling, some kind of calling. Like Abraham was called by God, so he's a chosen one, right? So people who feel that they have a calling, I've heard people, I have a calling to be a minister or a priest or whatever. That is part of this idea about the saintly metaphor, that you are called by God, chosen by God. You get a calling, whatever form that might take. The second is a covenant. In the case of Abraham, there was a covenant that was a promise on both sides to deliver something. And God promised Abraham the lands of Israel and all of that and great prosperity, but he would have to wait. It wasn't coming all right away, and in exchange, God expected total loyalty from Abraham. And that was the agreement that started it all out. And so you've got a calling, you've got an agreement, and then you've got the need for some sort of a test. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about the philosophy of this idea about a test. So God felt that he had to test Abraham, and so he said that you have to sacrifice your son, Ishmael. The other son, Isaac. You have to sacrifice Isaac. And he didn't want to do that, but of course he felt like it was necessary. And so he prepared Isaac for slaughter, and an angel of the Lord appeared to him and told him not to slaughter his son, but to instead slaughter a ram. Poor ram. Poor guy. He's sitting here. He said, say what? What? No, he said, Pam. Slaughter a Pam, not a ram. So that could be very confusing, I guess. But anyway, the point is, I don't know where that came from. The point of the story is that so he did. But he passed the test. That was the thing, and so that was the component. So you got a calling, some sort of covenant or an agreement, and then you've got this idea about a test, and that fits perfectly the idea of the Abrahamic legend, right? So Abraham. Here, I got a couple other things to say, and I haven't looked at this in so long. So Abraham was the prototype of the saint, the original prototype of the saint. And let's see what else this says. So we talked about the three elements of the major story, the calling, the covenant, and then the test. And that fits this profile of Abraham just swell. And then, but the moral of this whole story is that God is the sole source of meaning in life, that God decides what is meaningful in life. That is part of the saintly profile, that this dependence upon God. And God created the world and creates the covenant with humanity, and then sometimes tests us. And in that testing, in that covenant, in that agreement, in that calling, we find the meaning of life. And that's really what the story of Abraham really comes down to when you think about it. Now, so we had Abraham, who is the first idea of this saintly hero, and then there's years later, many years later, comes the life of Christ, the birth of Christ. Now, Christ was viewed by many theologians at the time, in early Christianity. He was viewed as the second Adam, so to speak, because he died and then came back to life, rose, and walked among us again. One could think of the idea about the Walking Dead, So he was the first of the Walking Dead. And I don't mean that in any way to be demeaning or anything like that. It's just that it was a new era that had come, a rebirth, so to speak, and a refocusing of the covenant. No longer would it require to sacrifice. No longer was death a part of the religion. You know, Christians never engaged in animal sacrifice or any of that sort of stuff, and the early Jews did until, of course, the rabbinical period of Judaism came along, and they stopped doing that because they were no longer access to temples. That's a whole other story. So where was I and who am I? What am I talking about? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So this new idea about this new hero that emerged, this new saint that emerged, was based upon love and compassion and forgiveness. Forgiveness is a human trait that is founded in love, and it says basically, I forgive you for whatever harm you may have done to me. And that was the idea about forgiveness. Remember, Christ, when he was on the cross, has said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgiveness was a hallmark of this movement and of this new emergence of the saintly figure. So there is something else written here. So this basically, we had the covenant between Abraham and basically God and the Jewish people, and now so we have this new covenant, a new covenant that released from death. Since Jesus was the Lamb of God. In Revelation, he's referred to as the Lamb of God. So with Jesus, that transcends everything. So Jesus died for our sins. Therefore, you never need to have any of these sacrifices again. It's that loving God and living the life is about living, not about death. It separates death, but yet death is still the inseparable partner, right? That still is with us. So we look at this idea about the Sermon on the Mount. The best one to read, there's three of them. One of the Gospels, and I can't remember which one, doesn't even have any kind of Sermon on the Mount. But the best one is Matthew, and it talks about, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We know about all of those sort of things. And it lays out a new world order that is based upon love and forgiveness. You want to read this, the Sermon on the Mount. I've even seen it on posters where people just post it in a room or something, because it's that profound, it's that beautiful. And it lays out this whole idea of the saintly metaphor, the metaphor of the saint, and that's how one lives a meaningful life, that Christ gives life meaning if one embraces the idea about love and forgiveness, and if one uses the idea about love and forgiveness in their own personal lives, in their day-to-day activities. But something massively changed. Here we go. 1517, October 31st. Anyone have any idea what happened in 1517, October 31st? Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral. And that changed everything. It's just amazing, because for 1,000 years, about 1,000 years, this idea of the saintly metaphor ruled, and the church ruled, and no one questioned the church. The church, we had liturgical authority and you had civil authority, and they were never, the civil authorities could never charge, could never try a person of the clergy, etc., and they were really quite separated until Martin Luther came along. And so he posted this idea about 95 Theses. The environment was, the church was doing things like selling indulgences. So they were raising money by saying, oh, you're a sinner, you're going to go to hell. But if you give me a bunch of money, you won't go to hell. How's that for a deal? Well, Martin Luther famously, rebelled against that kind of idea. But that wasn't the major thing that changed the world when we talk about Martin Luther and how he changed the world and how he actually got into this idea about the secular saint, about merging. For the first time, finally, someone is challenging the church. No one challenged. Look at what happened to Galileo and Copernicus and those people. They tried to challenge the church, and they ended up, Galileo locked away for the rest of his life in his own home, forbidden to write anything. They were terrified. So other people, you could see, you're going to take on the church? Good luck with that. But Martin had some very powerful friends, and they protected him, and they kept him safe from the wrath of the Pope and all of that sort of stuff. And so he posted these, and this idea, just this idea of going against the church in such a powerful way was basically the beginning of a change in the cultural dynamics of humanity. It changed a whole bunch of stuff there. It crushed all hopes for Christianity to be united, just crushed it right there. And basically what the Protestant movement was about was the idea of, well, here we go, sola scriptorum. Oh, we talked about merging the hero with the saint. I haven't looked at this in 5 years, so it's surprising to some of me. The idea about doctrine of sola scriptorum, the idea that individuals, what happened was there was a guy named Erasmus who was a theologian and a philosopher who lived before Martin Luther, shortly before, and he looked at the Bible and he did another translation of St. Paul's gospel, which was written in St. Paul's letters, which were written in Greek. And he said, wait a second, St. Paul says that man gets to heaven by faith alone, not by acts. And of course, the Catholicism or Christianity at the time was all about acts. It's what you do. It's you go through all this and then maybe you can get to heaven if you pay enough and all that sort of stuff. And so Martin Luther rebelled against all that and said, you don't let other people interpret Scripture for you. Don't let that happen. Don't let other people interpret Scripture for you. You as a divine being with a personal relationship with God. Now here we go about personal relationships with God. You can see about this idea of personal relationships with God has trickled down in the science of mind and a whole lot of new kind of thought and many Protestant religions. It's about a different way about the power of the individual. St. Paul believed in the idea of faith, how powerful faith was, and now we get Martin Luther talking about the individual's ability to create that relationship with God. No longer do we have to go through a church as an intermediary to get to God. We can have that personal relationship, and the papists didn't like that at all. And so it triggered all sorts of wars and all kinds of things. It led to the birth of empiricism, to liberalism, to the idea of believe it or not, of capitalism, and the formation eventually of the United States of America. It's a country you may have heard of. So this idea about sola scriptorum, the power of the individual, we talk about religions and New Thought religions, we talk about the power of the individual, build a personal relationship with God. And at the time, Martin was framing it in terms of interpretation of Scripture. But of course, that trickled out into society, and we see the emergence of the individual. That's pretty cool. He made a significant contribution to the formation of Western culture and the development of Western culture. So we're going to have to, I don't know what happened. So anyway, truth is the activity, subjectivity is the human capacity for faith in the absurd. This is Kierkegaard. So we're moving ahead, and because boy, wow, I'm running out of time. We're moving ahead, and we're talking about philosophers of the 19th century. We talk about Hegel, we talk about Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and this idea about truth is subjective. Kierkegaard thought that faith is absurd. Faith is absurd. That I'll tell you, I'm going to ease back into this story. This quote was supposed to be somewhere else in the presentation, and it ended up here. But it works. It'll work. It'll work. So we talk about these two ideas about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and it's difficult to talk about Kierkegaard unless you first talk about a guy named Hegel, who was a German philosopher who believed that now, for the first time, society is changing, and that society has the idea to drive science, that science can finally start asking questions that were forbidden before this idea about sola scriptorum. So finally, now science can move forward. So he was an empiricist. He was a scientist. Francis Bacon is the father of empiricism, but one of its major let's call it a protagonist, was Hegel. And Hegel talked about the importance of science and how life is grounded in science. It is grounded in the scientific method, and then this whole idea of people having faith in things they can't see. In other words, he was more of an Aristotelian philosopher rather than a Platonic type of philosopher. And so Kierkegaard responded, and in 1843 he wrote this book called Fear and Trembling. And what it was about was, he wrote about the experience of Abraham, but it wasn't just a recollection of the story of Abraham about the son and all of that sort of stuff. It was a subjective recalling of that. In other words, he tried to climb into the mind of Abraham, and he tried to think what was going on in Abraham's mind. Geez, he had to give up his son. Kierkegaard believed that just the idea of asking, how dare God do that? How dare he ask that? That's absurd. That's totally a capricious. We see the idea about a potential or an argument for a capricious God in the scriptures when we think about Job, right? Job was visited by God, from God, of all these terrible plagues and all of those sort of things. It was unnecessary. It was capricious. It was, whimsical. So who is this God that he thinks he can get away with this kind of stuff and just impose these terrible things on people just at his will? What the hell is that all about? And anyone who has faith in that has faith in the absurd. So he was tying the idea about faith as absurd. So clearly he's defending the Platonic view of how we come to know knowledge versus the Aristotelian view of how we come to gain knowledge. And so these two, the only reason I'm talking about these two is that they kind of lead me into the idea about existentialism. And existentialism has a special place in this kind of discussion. So let's talk about that. It's really about taking responsibility. So here's the idea. Existentialism is a little difficult to actually define. We use existential as an adjective when we're talking about something that is certain is absolutely going to happen and that sort of thing. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about existentialism as a philosophy, as a verb almost, kind of. So this idea about, it's difficult to define. We think of it in terms of people like 20th century philosophers, Sartre and Camus, and there's another guy, I can't remember, de Beauvoir, something like that. I can't remember his name. In any event, these philosophers were existentialism, but they had different viewpoints. But basically it was all about this. It's a cry for help. Existentialism is an idea, it's a survivalist technique, a mental survivalist technique that came into being against the backdrop of oppressive totalitarianism. The Germans and the Nazis invaded France during this period. And so this gave the idea of the philosophers were thinking, well, then what is meaning? Where's the meaning? Is life completely devoid of meaning? And they would say, yes, it is. You're living in something that has no meaning. It is existential. It is meaningless from that perspective. And, well, that's difficult. That's kind of a depressing viewpoint, but consider this. They were hiding. They were on the run. All of them were being chased by the Nazis. They were hiding out, and they would have been executed had they been found. And so they say, well, where's the meaning in this? Where's God now? Where's God now when we need him? And so that's the idea. The oppressive totalitarianism of Nazism drove the people in occupied France to have that kind of view, to give up hope, so to speak, because it seemed like that was the reality that they were going to have to live with. And the last bullet on here is so what existentialism really says, none of that matters. So you've got to make choices. You've got to do things like go up and blow up the, whatever it is, take action here. Because without action and commitment, that has no meaning. The only way you're going to pull meaning out of these horrors that are going on is through your own action and your own commitment to that action. And therein is how we derive meaning in life, because life in and of itself has no meaning. It has only the meaning that we, through our action and commitment, can give that. The meaning comes from us, not from some external circumstance of life, not coming from God or anything else. The only way we get meaning is by what we do as an individual and our commitments to justice. Justice keeps coming up a lot in terms of its relationship to these two metaphorical types. So I want to talk to you very briefly. Anybody ever read a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Wow, what an amazing book. It grew out of the concentration camps in World War II, and his only sin was that he was Jewish. And so he was confined to a concentration camp. And he looked around, and he saw some people are miserable. They're dying, they're giving up, and they're just fading away. But there's another group of people that are actually thriving under these horrible experiences. And he said, what's the difference between these two? And he came out with a term called logotherapy. And basically what this is he's saying that the difference between these two groups, the groups that were giving up and dying and the groups that were actually thriving, the difference is meaning. Meaningful life. The people who were thriving were looking at this from experience and thinking, wow, what meaning can I derive from this? The people who are giving up say life has no meaning, it's all work. Viktor Frankl, from his perspective, his meaning was, I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to live through this, and someday I'm going to write a book and tell everyone about it. So that gave meaning to his existence in that horrible, horrible, horrible environment. And the people, there were a few others that were striving, but each of them had that, and they were looking at it to find meaning in this, and that is the difference. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, wonderful book. I highly recommend it. So in summary, there is a summary, and I actually do have an off button, and I'm going to be hitting it pretty soon. So here we go. We talk about the summary of what we talked about. We talk about the archetype of the hero and of the saint, and how the hero engages in this idea about a struggle against impersonal odds, impersonal forces that are indifferent to our struggle, that are indifferent to our suffering, to our lives. They're indifferent to that, but we have to deal with them, and they do that basically in this manner of confronting it, right? And then we have this idea about the saint who is grounded in love, and we seek from the saint the idea of help. Well, that's what we want from the saint. And so these two areas, these two kind of different functions of the human experience, we look at them and we find that toward the Middle Ages, they kind of merged into this thing which we now refer to as the secular saint. We talked about some of the forces that contribute to that, the idea of posting these, the 95 Theses in 1517, etc. So, what else? Oh yeah, the message here, the overwhelming message that we get from a lot of these works is this idea that we have the capacity to create our own covenant with God. Even the existentialist would go that far. Says, you have the capacity to act and commit, and that's a commitment, that's a covenant that you make with yourself, with God, whoever it is that you're making that idea. So that's repeated throughout many of these historical periods and historical movements, philosophical movements. So we talked about merging the saint and the hero, how that was merged perfectly in someone like Martin Luther, where we had all these these saintly forces, these religious ideas, and he comes in with a worldwide view, a living worldwide view that brings that, and that changed man's idea about who he is, about how we should treat each other. This idea also of that we are consisting both of God and human traits. When we talked about, a while ago I talked about how do we come to know God, and so in this case we find out, that we do have something in common with God, that our soul and God are both formless, eternal beings. And so from that perspective, we are both divine and of this world. So in that sense, combining the divinity that we have, and Plato talked a lot about the soul's journey and talked about the idea of we want to return, we have a tendency to want to return to the soul's view of who we were before we descended from the divine and took on this form and became human beings. And one day we will leave that form and be reunited with God, with our soul. The soul's vision of it was before we descended into this form. So that's a message that came out of the study between both of these kind of metaphorical forms. And then lastly, we talk about the individual freedom to choose gives meaning to life. You confer your own meaning upon life, whether you are seeking, you are participating in the role of a hero or a saint or some hybrid of those two, that what you do, the things that you do, and the people you interact with, and the things you accomplish, and the things you try to accomplish, that's what gives meaning to life. That's what gives meaning to what Ernest Holmes would refer to as this thing called life. I'm not sure there's anywhere to go other than to jump off a bridge at this point, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to turn it over. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so grateful you were here. I had fun. I know you didn't, but I did, so there we go. All right. So I'm going to thank you, and thank you, Greg, again for being here and for doing all your magical technical stuff back there in the booth. At this point, there's a general tendency of mine to shut up. So I'm going to turn this over to Dee. Thank you, Dee, for that beautiful treatment, and we're going to do one more, okay, as we close out the night. God bless each and one of you. Thank you. Namaste.
So I add my own thank yous and ask you to join in this closing treatment. So as we celebrate all that we've heard from our wonderful Paulette, as we contemplate and internalize that what is ours to learn from all of this, what we take with us and what we share with others, we remember that there is only one everywhere present, all-knowing, all-powerful Spirit, and that each and every one of us are an expression of that Spirit. We are the power and presence of God. And what we just heard tonight reminds us of how we got there, how we learned more about ourselves through this. So hero or saint, and as we move on to whatever is next for each and every one of us, we do so with safety, with a kind of peace that comes from being in community, and we know with absolute certainty that all is well in our world. So I now release this word to law, knowing with absolute certainty that each of us are loved and valued expressions of God, and together we say, and so it is.